Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Naturalist Nights. Delighted to see you all this evening. We are in for a real treat tonight with Dr. Tanya Schenk from the National Park Service, but before we begin, I have a couple of quick announcements. First of all, my name is Denali. I'm one of the winter naturalists here at ACES this season, and I grew up in Colorado. I have a very strong personal connection to the Roaring Fork Valley, and one of my favorite things about ACES has always been the community aspect. We have such a strong community here full of people who really care about the land that we live on, so I'm glad you're all here tonight affirming that. In fact, you might say that the links binding our community are very strong this evening. Naturalist Nights are made possible through a partnership between ACES, the Wilderness Workshop, and the Roaring Fork Audubon. I'd encourage you guys to chat with some of the folks who are here tonight from those organizations and see what's going on. And I'd also like to draw attention to our sponsors. These local businesses generously support Naturalist Nights through donations that allow us to bring or to cover the travel expenses of our presenters, and in turn to be covered by Grassroots TV. There's Mike in the back. We will be able to view this presentation several times this month on the Grassroots TV channel. It's channel 12 here in Aspen and channel 82 down Valley. Just check your local listings, and it will also be online in less than a month. So soon, you will be able to enjoy this presentation with just a few links. Let's see. So finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Tanya Schenk to the podium. We were really lucky to have her here tonight. She's all the way from the Biological Resource Management Division of the National Park Service down in Fort Collins, and before she held that prestigious position, she headed up the Lynx Reintroduction project here in Colorado, bringing back one of our favorite, most charismatic predators to this wonderful state. So as much as I tried to convince her to change the title of her presentation to "We Are Only as Strong as Our Weakest Lynx," she's got something really outstanding in store for us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tanya Schenk.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the invitation out here. It's lovely to get back on the western side. I'm spending way too much time on the Front Range these days. So, okay, so to get me started, you said to hit... Oh, excuse me. Forgot already.
There too.
Okay. Reintroductions are becoming a really common tool in conservation, and carnivore reintroductions are a really special case of reintroductions, and that's because carnivores often play a really key role in ecosystems. So people view returning carnivores back to the ecosystem as a way to really start getting at reestablishing the ecosystem integrity that's been lost once a carnivore has left that particular ecosystem. And that's really exciting, but the difficult part of carnivore reintroductions is they often require huge spatial, they have big spatial needs, and they often can cause lots of conflicts with human activities. So they can be a real biological challenge and a real political challenge. And for that reason, what we have to be really careful of is it seems like we have to be even more careful with a carnivore reintroduction. And because of that, we have to take every carnivore reintroduction that has occurred and really study it and really try to learn from our mistakes and our successes in those previous carnivore reintroductions before we start on the next one. And the more we learn from that, the better we can make them as they follow up. And one of the things I wanted to point out, since now I wear a National Park Service hat, whereas most of my career was with the state, is people ask me, why is the National Park Service interested in carnivore reintroductions? I mean, we all know the national parks are some of our most beautiful landscapes in North America, but we also have to admit they're tiny postage stamps out there. And so almost no national park is going to be able to contain or have an area large enough to contain a carnivore population, especially large carnivores. And what we have recognized, and lots of other people do too, is we are never going to be able to maintain the resources in our national parks unless we work for conservation outside the national parks. I mean, the more fragmented our landscapes become, the more isolated our national parks become, the less we're going to be able to hold the resources in those national parks. So we're trying to work with other agencies and other conservation organizations to really work towards conservation at any scale, because we just aren't going to protect our parks if we don't do that. I just wanted to kind of say the park districts are really trying to work outside their borders, so we're trying to do that a lot. So what I wanted to touch on is because I think everybody here is probably really interested in the Lynx reintroduction itself, is I want to use the Lynx reintroduction as an example to show you the kinds of things that we learned from that we can apply to other reintroduction efforts. And I spent about 13 years of my life on this project, so I can get pretty animated and excited. So I'm going to try not to do what I did in Carbondale, which just kept talking and talking and talking, but try to hit the highlights about where the reintroduction stands now and what we learned from it and what we can take away to use in other carnivore reintroductions. And the one big thing I do want to point out is that although I'm here from the National Park Service now with that hat on, the Colorado reintroduction effort was a Colorado Division of Wildlife project, and it was an enormous undertaking which is now the Colorado Parks and Wildlife, I guess. So I don't want to detract from them, and I want to give full support and recognition to the Colorado Division of Wildlife for what it was that they were trying to do. So just a little bit of a background. The Canada lynx, Colorado was the southernmost historical distribution of the Canada lynx, but we felt like there was not a viable population of lynx left in Colorado. We thought there might be a few stragglers left in Colorado, possibly, but not enough to make a viable population. The other thing that the Colorado Division of Wildlife did is they looked and say, because one of the big things you have to think about when you think about reintroductions is your source population of animals. Are there animals out there that are very similar, and that means genetically similar to what used to be here? And we did find that was the case, that the lynx that are in Canada and Alaska were genetically similar to what used to be here in Colorado. And then what we also looked at is the fact that we were so isolated from other populations that we didn't feel there was any chance that the lynx were going to reestablish themselves back here in Colorado. And so reintroduction became the only option. If we wanted to bring this predator back to Colorado, try to reestablish the integrity of our ecosystems here, we were going to have to use reintroduction. And as our landscapes become more and more and more fragmented, that's why reintroductions are becoming a more and more and more popular tool. An alternative to that is improving corridors, and I'll talk more about that later. But in this particular situation, we felt that reintroduction was our only option. The other thing to think about is, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, when you used to talk about reintroductions, you always looked to history to try to help you make a biologically sound decision about whether or not an animal should be brought back here. And you always said, well, did they historically occur here? Did their prey base historically occur here? And now with climate change, we have to start thinking about the fact that history isn't going to be the only thing that is going to help us make good, sound biological decisions. We're going to have to try to look a little bit into the future to say, is this reintroduction really an ethical thing to do? Are we still going to have the habitat for this particular animal? It may historically have occurred here, but with climate change, are we still going to have that habitat available, and is this the right thing to do? So this is kind of a scary and a new realm for biologists to work in, is that we have to look towards the future as well as what occurred historically in order to make these kinds of decisions. And it's not a perfect crystal ball, and it's becoming a really difficult decision because we're also trending towards even introductions and not just reintroductions, bringing animals into new ecosystems that we think in the future will be good for that particular animal if we're going to conserve it. So it's something to think about. We did think about this with the Canada lynx, and we looked at what they're calling vulnerability assessments and felt there was still going to be sufficient habitat for lynx in Colorado, even with the changes that we're anticipating with our global climate change. So this part, the next couple slides, these are things I normally don't talk about when I talk about the Colorado lynx reintroduction effort. But now that I'm wearing a different hat and I'm trying to think about lots of reintroductions across lots of different landscapes throughout the United States, you have to think about the things that go into a reintroduction. This is not a simple thing, especially a carnivore reintroduction, all the things that go on behind the scenes. I'm just going to touch on these really briefly. The one good thing about or one thing we got really lucky with the Colorado lynx reintroduction was it was a single state effort. And if you've ever pulled together a group of people from different agencies and organizations, you know how difficult that can be. And the fact that we were working within a single organization was really helpful to us. But that isn't always the case. But even knowing the Colorado Division of Wildlife was going to try to do this reintroduction, we were still working with like the Wildlife Commission. We had to work with the Fish and Wildlife Service because they were the regulatory agency. This was going to be a listed animal. We also had to bring in what we called the Lynx Advisory Team. I mean, we're bringing back an animal that we didn't have any in the state. And we were a state agency, so we didn't have any researchers or biologists that had hands-on experience really with lynx. So we had to bring in outside people that could help us with reintroductions, carnivore reintroductions, lynx-specific expertise. And we also had to bring in public relations experts. And I think this is something we kind of learned on the fly a little bit. But as biologists, we have to make sure we get outside of our box. And if I mentioned that carnivore reintroductions can be really politically challenging as well as biologically challenging. And I think more and more any wildlife management we do, it's something the public has to be involved in. We have to keep them aware, we have to get their support, because without the public support, these things aren't going to happen. We aren't going to be able to get the funding, we aren't going to be able to get what turned out to be a lot of help from the public in pulling something like this off. So the public relations became really important too. But I think one of the things that helped us most, and it's a lesson that I try to give to other people about reintroductions, is we were a single state trying to pull this off, but even within the Colorado Division of Wildlife, if you know any of us, we all have our own opinions, of course. So it took a very strong leader within the Colorado Division of Wildlife to lead this effort. And even though you credited me with that, it wasn't me. The Colorado Division of Wildlife terrestrial manager, Rick Kahn, was actually the program leader. So and you need a strong leader because I'm going to go through a whole list of things that had to happen. Like I mentioned before, public relations, we needed press releases, websites, internet sightings, how we were going to keep the public informed about things that were going on. We didn't do a great job at that at the beginning. We got better at it as it went along. You had to think about acquisition of animals. Where are you going to get them from? How are you going to take care of them? How are you going to transport them down here? How are you going to get international permits for bringing animals down? That was an enormous thing even of itself. Animal husbandry. What kind of holding facility are you going to have down here? How are you going to take care of the animals in the pens? What are you going to do when things go wrong? Who's going to be your veterinarian? What kind of veterinary care are you going to give? To what extent are you going to care for these animals? When do you choose euthanasia over holding something captive, over releasing it and hoping that it can make it out there on its own? You have to think about all these things. Then where are you going to release animals? Where are you going to release them? When are you going to release them? Who gets to be at the releases? Again, looping back to this public involvement. People want to go there, you want them to see it, and yet you have to take care of the individual animal and try to minimize that stress. And all of these things are really almost kind of fighting against each other. And then you have that, all of that happens even before you release the animal. And then once you release the animal, you've got all kinds of things about how you're going to monitor the animal. And that sounds great, but once you monitor the animal, it means you have more information about it. Who gets that information? Who owns the data? How much do you tell the public? How much do you tell other agencies? What do you do with a wayward animal that went where you didn't want it to go? How do you get other states involved when you get dispersal into other states? Law enforcement became huge because of the poaching issue, education, and things like that. And all of these things you should be thinking about ahead of time. A lot of things that the division did is we tried to think of some of these things in the beginning, but mostly it was a progress. It worked out over the 10 or 12 years. And so what we can learn from this is tell the next people doing reintroduction efforts to think about these things in advance and they'd be a lot better off and not spending the 50, 60, 70-hour days, it seemed like, trying to work these things out as they were going on. But the point is that in order for all of us to work together with all these different people that you needed, with all these different expertise, you had to have a common goal. And I think that's what Rick was really excellent about, what the Division of Wildlife did. This project was no one person's project. It was not for anyone's advancement or anything like that. Every single person that worked on this project at the division, the whole objective was to make this reintroduction effort work and to make everything work towards the highest survival rate of every individual animal that was brought down here. And every time we started having snags or hiccups, you came back to that common goal. And I would recommend that to any reintroduction effort, is that you keep the goal in mind front and center. And that is the health and welfare of each individual animal and trying to establish a viable population of animals. And that will help you hold things together during the rough times. And each one of these things I brought up, we could give a presentation about. But yeah, there you go. Okay, that's what I need to hear, is the kind of get to this. We'll hold on this slide for a minute so you can absorb those kittens. So the Colorado Lynx reintroduction effort, the primary goal, and there's a couple of key words in this, was to establish a self-sustaining viable population of lynx in the state. And so self-sustaining means any reintroduction effort is an enormous amount of management up front. You have to find the animals, the source population, you bring them down, all the things I described. It's a lot of hands-on management. But we wanted to establish a viable population of lynx that eventually we could move away from all of that super hands-on, intensive management of the species. We wanted to get something down here that could survive and reproduce on its own. Not all reintroduction efforts have that same goal. They realize that they're going to have to continually manage, but it's a decision you should make in advance. And if you are going to make your goal a self-sustaining population, then you have a lot of other considerations. And that, one of the first ones is, how many animals do you bring down? How big of an effort do you do? It's one of the first things when you start studying reintroductions, is that it takes a lot more animals than you think to get a population established, and it takes a lot more time and a lot more animals than you think. So we released 218 lynx from 1999 through 2006 to make this reintroduction effort work. The other thing the Division of Wildlife was adamant about is they not only wanted to make this a self-sustaining population, which meant bringing a lot of animals down, but they also wanted to be able to evaluate and say, did we reach our goal? And that means they had to do a lot of monitoring afterwards. And that's the part, the little piece in all of those other things that had to go on for reintroduction that I worked on. And that's what I'm going to focus on for most of the rest of the talk. And the other thing is, we had to make sure there was enough habitat and a big enough prey base, again, for that self-sustaining population. So to that end, I'm going to focus a lot more now on the post-release monitoring and research objectives, and that was so that we could evaluate how we did in this reintroduction effort. And there were a couple of key things we were looking at. We wanted to describe lynx distribution and movement patterns, and that helps us understand whether or not they had established site fidelity. Once you release these animals, they have to stay in an area in order to be the population we wanted. We also wanted to describe the habitat use here in Colorado, and a big part of that was, is there anything we can do as managers then to improve that habitat, to make it even better for lynx here? And so that was a huge component of what we wanted to look at. In order to evaluate whether or not we were successful with the reintroduction, we had to look at survival and reproduction of the population and make sure that those parameters were such that we could have a self-sustaining population. And then, this is key. You cannot study a carnivore unless you study its prey, and that's just flat out. You can never really understand what's going on with your carnivores unless you understand what's going on with the prey base. And so the division committed to studying snowshoe hare, which is the primary prey species for Canada lynx. And to that end, every single animal that was released with a radio collar on. Again, this is a super invasive management, very strong management approach to have every animal in your population radio collared. But we knew we needed that in the very beginning, but we always wanted to work towards being able to monitor our lynx in Colorado non-invasively. And I'm going to be taking you through that process. But we knew that was one of the things we really wanted to work on. And as it turned out, this monitoring program was absolutely essential to making this reintroduction effort a success. And I'll go into the reasons for that a little bit later. So as we go through, I'm just going to give you the top things that have happened under those 4 big major objectives that I was looking at. And so the first one we talked about was looking at dispersal and distribution monitoring. And the first thing that I would recommend to people, I know we put out, the collars we put on the Lynx were both satellite and VHF transmitters. And I know that all sounds passé now, but in 1999, the satellite collars were actually experimental. These aren't GPS collars, they were satellite collars. And they were experimental, and so it was something that was out there. So what I would tell people, and in the end, it was absolutely what we needed. I mean, you know the kind of terrain the Lynx are in. Even with the VHF signals, you have to fly to find the Lynx, or I mean, our ground crews could no way cover all of that area, and even our pilots couldn't cover all the areas where the Lynx were dispersing to. And the satellite was critical because they're getting the information that the signals beam to the satellite and then comes back down to us via an email. And the lesson I think we learned from this is, I would tell biologists right off the bat, look at cutting edge technology. I mean, technology is going crazy. I mean, it's really exciting to be a biologist these days. There's all kinds of things out there. And there's all kinds of ways that we can monitor these animals and get a fuller picture of what's going on with them when they're out there. And so that's sort of the take-home lesson from that, is that we were willing to go out on a limb and buy these satellite collars, and in the end, they were one of the best investments that we made on the project. Because this is what happened. This is what happened with the dispersal of the Lynx. Way down in the corner, that little yellow area, that's our study area. That's southwest Colorado. That's where we hoped to establish our Lynx population. And every dot you see up there is a Lynx location. And so the purple dots you see up there are the ones we picked up from flying, and all the green triangles are the things, the locations we got from the satellites. So if we think about it, if we thought all the Lynx were only going to stay in our study area, we only would have monitored in the yellow, look at all the locations we would have missed. If we would have only flown in Colorado, we were again a state effort, and you can see how many locations we got in Colorado of the purple, but look at all the green, everything we would have missed if we had not put satellite collars out there. And so lessons learned from this, and it's probably not atypical for carnivore reintroductions, is these guys can usually move. And I think this is a pretty amazing slide every time I look at it. I mean, we've got the cat that goes to Iowa, we've got one in Nebraska, we even had, I mean, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and one even went back to Canada. But the key things to learn about this too is that some people look at this slide and think this was a failure of the reintroduction effort. But instead, I think you have to look at it in the positive light, and that is that most of the cats stayed in Colorado. And Lynx have strong dispersal capabilities, which is going to be a great thing for them under climate change scenarios. And that not all the dispersal was one way. We had cats that would go to Montana and come back, go back to Montana, come back. So these weren't one-way movements necessarily for all of these cats, which was an incredible thing. And it also pinpointed to us, well, if our cats can go to Montana and come back, maybe the cats that are in Montana are coming down here now. You know, so we may be getting some movements back and forth between the other populations. And the other thing is, again, that in these atypical habitats, we always think that lynx were completely tied to snowshoe hare, and they are. They're tightly tied to snowshoe hare. But given climate change and the hopes we have to have for our animals to be able to adapt to what might be new novel ecosystems out there, like the cat that went to Iowa, he died, he was hit by a car, but when we picked up his carcass, he was huge. He was fat, and I can promise you he was not eating snowshoe hare in Iowa. So they can figure out how to eat other things and how to survive in these atypical habitats. So there's positive things to learn about this. The other thing that's exciting about this is because we have this data set, we actually can look at corridors versus habitat use, like home range habitat use. We can say, okay, there seems to actually be some sort of pattern in the way that they're moving. And we've got a new PhD student, and the Park Service is helping to fund this along with the Colorado Division of Wildlife, to try to identify what does a lynx need for a corridor. A lot of times people think corridors are just long, skinny home ranges, or they need exactly the same habitat in a corridor that they need in a home range. And that's not necessarily the case. And if we can open that key to figure out maybe some lesser things that they need that can be just as good as a corridor, those are the kind of things we need to get established on the landscape. And that's not just for lynx, but that would be for any wildlife species, because they're going to have to be able to move and adapt to our changing climates. And so we have an incredible data set that we can show lots of long distance dispersal movements. And that was what we looked at for habitat use at the landscape scale. When you're flying over or satellite locations, you get those locations. The other habitat use data that we collected was over on the left. Was we snow tracked these cats. And I don't know if any of you guys have found tracks of lynx around here and backtracked them too, but it's a great way to get out on the landscape, and you can actually see exactly what the cat's doing on the ground. So if you fly over an area, you know a cat was there, but you don't know what it was doing there. When you backtrack on snow tracks, you actually can say, oh, the cat was traveling, or the cat made a kill here. You can learn so much more information from that. And the third kind of habitat information that we collected was we did actually go into the den sites, because we needed to find out not only get very site-specific information on den sites, but we also had to find out, how many kittens there were and the sex ratio and things like that. Again, that was a very invasive approach to getting information about reproduction, and that was something we knew we wanted to move away from. And I'll tell you how we did that later on. But what we've done with this information is we took all of the locations from the satellite and the aerial locations. We said, okay, here's where we found the cats. Now, where are areas just like that in the rest of the state where we might find lynx? And so this is a predictive map. The more red the location is, or the areas are, the more likely you'll find lynx there. And the big map is winter use, and the smaller map over there is summer use. And so this is something that land managers were looking for, to say, okay, where should we start looking to try to improve habitat for lynx in the state? Not just where we found them, but where else might they disperse to? And so we finally were able to complete this report and get this out there. And so all of those locations have helped us generate this predictive map. And then the site scale information that we got from the snow tracking, this information is, like I said, on the one hand, you know a cat was there and it might be there, but this is the sort of thing that we are finding on the ground, is what is the canopy cover in that spot? What kind of understory do we have? Is there anything we can do as managers to find out how we can modify our forest or help our forest have these sorts of parameters which would improve habitat for snowshoe hare, and improves habitat for lynx. We were also able to get information on winter diet, because we could find the kills, and we could find that the lynx were killing mostly snowshoe hare, which was their primary prey item, and then red squirrel, which is their secondary prey item. We're also finding areas like these funnel areas over there, areas where the cats repeatedly use. This is a log crossing across a creek, and it was the junction of 4 different lynx home ranges, and all 4 of the lynx would use that same little road cross. That was like their little diner spot or the bar for those 4 cats, but they all use that area. And it's just kind of an interesting behavioral thing to learn about how we can help things on the landscape to improve them for the lynx that you can't get from just flying over and not getting the exact locations on the ground. The other work, and like I said, what we could get is, when we snow tracked, we would find out, okay, is this a travel site? Is this an area where we found scat, which often was a territory mark, where they had their day beds, which meant those are areas where they felt really comfortable spending lots of hours. And the more important one is where they made their kills. And this is a project that we've got going on right now with a postdoc at Yale, and we're looking just at the places where they encountered snowshoe hare, looking where they were successful at making snowshoe hare kills and where they were unsuccessful. And again, we're trying to fine-tune what managers could do on the landscape to really improve habitat for lynx. And getting right at where if they don't eat, none of the other things, matter. And it's where they eat in winter, which is critical, and that's exactly the kind of data that we have. And so we're pursuing that with some great new statistical approaches. So that's another whole avenue of people that you have to get heavily involved with, is what kind of data should you collect on the ground that will help you with these management techniques. So we've looked at distribution, how they move across the landscape, what kind of habitats they're using. The next big thing we had to look at was mortality. And the first thing that you think, okay, well, that's easy to do. Biologists have been estimating mortality rates, for 100 years. You just estimate the mortality rate. Well, when you think about a reintroduction effort, remember down there in the yellow circle, down there in southwestern Colorado, that was the area that we were hoping we would establish a viable population that would then disperse out and hopefully fill out the rest of the areas in Colorado that were suitable for lynx. And instead we got all these locations, and a lot of these locations outside of that core area also included where they died. So animals died outside the core area as well as inside the core area. So if we would take all the data from all the animals and estimate survival rates or mortality rates, we were going to get a really biased estimate, and it was going to be biased low, because the animals that dispersed, like to Iowa or all the way to Canada, think about all the things they went through, they had a higher probability of dying than the ones that stayed in southwest Colorado, which is where we thought the best habitat was. And if we would have crunched all of that together, we would have biased our estimates high, and that would have made us not actually really evaluate the survival rates and the mortality rates appropriately. So what we did is, well, I jumped ahead a little too quick. What we did is we estimated survival or mortality rate inside the study area and outside the study area. So this is what we found, is that as the cats were first released here, the mortality rate is the highest when they're first released, and then it drops off the longer the cats are out there. This is what it looked like inside the study area. And if we estimated it outside the study area, the red line is outside the study area. So you can see from that our hypothesis was correct, that the mortality rates were much higher outside the study area than inside the study area, but it had the same shape. Really high mortality right after they're reintroduced, and then it flattens out. If you want to look at that in a better approach, think about it in a more positive light, and that's survival. What I want to point out here is we introduced animals over a number of different years, 99, 2000, 2003, 4, and 5, and another one 2006. Well, what you see here is the blue lines, the blue triangles, that's showing survival rate after 6 months. And it's really high. It goes from about 82% up into the 90%. That's a high survival rate for carnivores. The red are what happens in the first 6 months. And in every instance, every time we had a big release of cats, the survival was a lot lower in the first 6 months, and it was dramatically lower in the first 2 years. And so when we were monitoring this as it was going on, but we said, okay, here's a chance to learn something, that what happened in those first 2 years, what happens in those first 6 months that we could change for future reintroductions that would improve the survival rate. And so we looked at a whole bunch of different influencing factors, things like where the cats came from was a big one, because we got them from the Yukon, Quebec, British Columbia, Alaska, Manitoba. Did the sex of the cat matter? Did it matter whether or not the females were pregnant when they came down? Was there a difference in when we released them? And we looked at all of these factors, and the only thing that was critical that made a big difference was the time in captivity. So this was a huge thing for us to find out. And what this graph is showing is, if you release a cat before about having 45 days in the pens, this is what happens to their mortality. It's sky high. If you hold a cat at least at 45 or 60 days in the pens, you get your very lowest mortality rates. And so this was an enormous thing for us to learn, because we don't know exactly why, but we're thinking that, it gave them time to calm down. When they were in the pens, we could give them a really high quality diet, really beef them up so that when they were released, they were in the very best body condition they possibly could be in. And the timing of this also, we were capturing cats in Canada in the wintertime, which is the easiest time to capture them. And if you hold them 60 days, we were holding them until spring. and you were releasing them, and that's when the prey base was at its highest. We had, you know, the snowshoe hare starting to have their young, you've got things coming out of hibernation, and you've got the most prey on the ground right at spring for them. And so this was one of the biggest things we could find to give other reintroduction efforts is when in the early years when we released them, earlier than that, our thinking was the best thing you can do for a wild animal is get it back out in the wild, that every day you have them in captivity, you're stressing them and making it worse. And it was exactly the opposite for lynx. I don't know about other carnivore species. The other thing we were worried about is people worry that you can hold things in pens too long. And then they all of a sudden say, oh, I know where I can get my bunny at night, you know, from a human being. And but you don't see, if that would have been the case, these lines would have gone back up. Because we held some cats as long as 135 days. And their mortality rate didn't go up. So for the lynx, that didn't have a problem, but releasing them too soon definitely did. So this was a huge lesson we learned that we can pass on. The flip side of mortality is that you want to find out, okay, so we've improved our release protocols, but once they're out there, what are they dying from? And this is something that what we found out, even though we did necropsies on every cat that we could find, you still sometimes can't figure out cause of death. A lot of times the carcass is too far gone and sometimes you just can't get it. So most of them were unknown cause of death. But our biggest cause of death were human caused, being shot and being hit by vehicle. And unfortunately, this is not, you know, just special to reintroduced animals. This is something real for all of our wildlife. These are two really big things. But I think probably carnivores, the being shot is something that is sort of carnivore unique. As managers, all we can do is public education, you know, better law enforcement, you know, even with better law enforcement. I mean, it's fundamentally an education thing and trying to get to the public and explain why the carnivores are useful to our ecosystems. The other things that were interesting for us were to find the plague, and this is something we had not anticipated, and this is something that, again, I think thinking about disease, wildlife biologists are becoming more and more and more in tune to thinking about the effects of disease and how that plays a role in the ecology of our wildlife. But plague is an introduced disease. Cats are highly susceptible. All your cats, your domestic cats, everything are highly susceptible to plague. And this was a real concern to us because when the lynx started showing up dead from plague, we have no way to vaccinate a wild population effectively from a disease. And so part of the good part of our big management effort of keeping active radio collars on the cats was we had a recapture program to re-put collars on as the batteries would die so we could continue to monitor these cats. Well, when we would recapture the cats, we always collected blood. And one of the best things we found out was this 27% of the cats that we caught were seropositive for plague, which meant they had been exposed to it but survived it. And so this means that some of those cats out there have a natural immunity to plague. And this was the very best piece of information we could find because we aren't going to be able to manage for plague. But if the cats are going to do it on their own, then this is the best piece of information we could get. So disease is another thing for people to have on the radar screen for thinking about reintroductions and what's going to go on with that. The other thing to highlight down here is in the predation and the probable predation, some of that was mountain lion and bobcat. But also we had lynx killing lynx. We had territorial disputes by males to the death. And this is something else you have to think about for carnivore reintroductions, and especially the way we did it over so many years, is you're sending out animals that are territorial, they establish a territory, and then all of a sudden we release another 40 individuals out there who could be very competitive. And so we were constantly kind of breaking up social structure, and sometimes that led to death, but more importantly, you know, it was disrupting that social structure. And it's something that people need to plan for, I think, in carnivore, anything that's a territorial animal if you're going to do a reintroduction. And part of that predation was also infanticide. So we did document, too, that if the male dies of the female-male pair and they have kittens, the new male will kill those kittens. And that's been documented elsewhere, too. But that was something for us to learn, too, and to think about where you release those new cats and try to stay away from some of those already established social structures that are in there. Then the last part, so now we've covered everything and the mortality, and of course you're not going to have a self-sustaining population without reproduction. So we got cats staying in Colorado, they were surviving well, and then as most of you remember, it was a pretty long haul to get to reproduction. We started our reintroduction effort in 1999, and we didn't get any reproduction through 2002. And we were starting to go crazy wondering, okay, you know, what's wrong with this picture? And so one of our biggest concerns was this fact that we realized we were messing with the social structure. And so we did realize that, and that's why those couple of years between like 2001, 2, and 3, we did, or 2001 and 2, we didn't release additional animals. We were trying to maintain those social structures. And then we started getting stable breeding pairs, what could have been stable breeding pairs, but they still weren't producing young. So the next thing we thought about was, okay, you have to think about the prey base. Maybe there aren't enough snowshoe hare out there for them to have young. We had to think about if snowshoe hare cycle in Colorado, did we release them at a low snowshoe hare time? The other thing is you have snowshoe hare out there that hadn't been susceptible to lynx predation for a long time. And so did we create a predator pit where we sent out all of a sudden all these lynx and all these naive bunnies are out there and we just wiped out the snowshoe hare? You know, I had to think about that. And the other thing that Jake Ivan, who worked on the hares, came up with is this decoupling of pelage with snowshoe hare. And they've been looking at this in Montana as well. And with climate change, you know, snowshoe hares are white in the wintertime, and then they change their pelage to brown except for their feet, like in that picture, in the summertime. And what's happening with the change in our snowfall is we're getting white bunnies on a brown background and brown bunnies on a white background because we're asynchronizing when the bunnies or the snowshoe hares are used to changing their pelage. So they become really highly susceptible to predation at that time from everything. So what we did, we started our snowshoe hare studies, and the first one, Jen Zaraka did her master's thesis and was just trying to get where's the highest density of snowshoe hare. And we found out it was in the mature spruce fir forest. And then while we were completing that study, we got lucky, and in 2003 we found the first kittens. And we were very lucky with that. Obviously, we were thrilled. It was very exciting. And I can promise you, by that time, we had learned to get this sort of information into the press immediately. So, and this was back in the day when none of us had a digital camera out there. And we had to run our photographs into the grocery store, or the place that did 1 hour processing, so we could show and prove that we had kittens. So that's how long ago this was for us. But so 2003 was a great year because we got our reproduction. And then we were kind of in a great period from 2003, 4, and 5. You can see these are the percent females in this year that had young. And so we were hovering between 40 and 50% of our radio-collared females were having kittens, 2003, 4, and 5. And we're like, yay, we are over the hurdle. This is great. And 2006 came, dropped down to about 9%. 2007, 2008, 0 kittens found. No kittens. And we're like, uh-oh, what's happened? Luckily, in 2009 and 10, popped back up. So what we looked at is we're like, okay, we don't know a snowshoe hare cycle in Colorado, but when lynx are in Canada, where we know the hare cycle, the reproduction goes up and down with that hare cycle. So when the hares crash, the lynx no longer have young, and then they bounce back when the snowshoe hares bounce back. So it's this big cyclic thing. This is another lesson to learn. If you're working with a cyclic species, possibly you're going to have to monitor a lot longer to make sure they come out of it. So luckily what we did with this is we had a second project was ongoing with hares. This was a PhD student now working on this. And part of both the master's project and this project was getting snowshoe hare densities. And we could have a whole program just on the snowshoe hare stuff, but what I'm going to focus on is the one thing we learned here is we already learned that the highest densities of the hares were often in the spruce fir. That was the most stable place. So the gray bars are the density of snowshoe hare we got from these master studies where they were looking at ecology of snowshoe hare. The red bars are the percent females having young. So what we were trying to look at is, did this match up? And here's a lesson to be learned, is if you're looking at predator-prey relationships, you need to have your graduate students overlap. Because right in here, we had a break. This master student was writing her thesis, and this PhD student was writing a study plan, so we missed some years there. So that's another lesson to learn. But you can kind of see a pattern that maybe as the snowshoe hare densities were higher, we got reproduction. When the snowshoe hare densities were lower, that's when we had the poor reproduction, and when the hare densities came back up, it looks like that's when we got reproduction. There's lots of holes in this, but I think if we, understanding lynx biology from up north, it's a little bit supportive of this, but this is a lesson to teach people in the future too. But we're thinking that what happened is the hares did cycle, did get lower, and the exciting news about that is that the lynx were able to sustain that low hare population and then come back up and have reproduction when it came back. So the last question we wanted to ask is, were we successful? Do we have a viable population of lynx in Colorado? And so we took all the information that I presented here about how many cats we reintroduced, what their mortality rates were, what their reproductive rates were, and the snowshoe hare densities, and thinking that they might possibly be cyclic. The fact that we had good site fidelity, we've had cats still in the area, and we took all that information and we put it in a very simple viability model. This is very, very, very simplistic. And what we did is we said, okay, if we take all these parameters, and if they happen in that order over the next 20 years, will we still have lynx? And what you see is we have a cyclic population of lynx with a slight increase. The black line is the females and the gray line is the males. You can punch a lot of holes in this. There can be all kinds of things happen to interrupt this, but this is the best information we have. And what the Division of Wildlife did with this information is that they said they were willing to say that the reintroduction was successful. But what that doesn't, it doesn't say that the lynx are home free in Colorado. Now they're another one of our species that we have to protect in order to keep them in Colorado. But we feel like over those years, those 12 years, given these parameters, the fact that we did go through a period of no reproduction and pop back out of that, that we think the reintroduction was successful, and that's how they're counting it. But we have a lot we can do to continue to manage and look for ways we can enhance habitat here in Colorado to keep our lynx here. So roughly, again, trying to watch the time so you have time for questions, I've touched on all the accomplishments, but I think for future reintroduction efforts, certainly of future reintroductions of lynx, but for a lot of other carnivores, the Colorado Division of Wildlife has contributed a wealth of information to carnivore reintroductions. We certainly looked at release protocols very critically, and I think we developed some excellent release protocols that ended up in very high survival rate of individual animals from this project. We feel like we have established a viable population of lynx in Colorado. We've done a lot of data analysis and have provided information out there for managers about how they can manage to enhance our habitat for lynx here in Colorado. We are well on our way to understanding snowshoe hare ecology better here in Colorado, and that's interesting because, you know, we don't have that many resources. You tend to study something that's either threatened and endangered or something that's hunted, and that's where the money goes. And you have something like snowshoe hare, and nobody ever has any funds to study that. And so we've really helped through this project and these snowshoe hare studies to get a little better understanding of some of our other species that are using our forests. The other big thing that I'm just going to touch on very briefly because we're so short of time is that I mentioned earlier that what we wanted to do was move away from this really heavy management and needing to put radio collars on all the animals constantly. And with all of the new exciting breaks in or discoveries in technology and things, we have designed a non-invasive sampling protocol for lynx, and it's based on snow tracking and putting cameras out. It's called a site occupancy modeling effort. And Dr. Jake Ivan, who did the PhD on the snowshoe hare ecology, when I retired from the division, he took on the Lynx project, and he's working on that. And he's a super great person. You definitely need to invite him next year, or whenever you have him again. He'll give you a great talk. But he has taken, I started this non-invasive protocol, but he has taken it light years ahead of what, and further since I've left. And we can do all of this monitoring, looking for reproduction, looking for survival, looking for distribution across the landscape, all non-invasively. There's no need to answer those questions, those particular questions anymore by having to put radio collars on individual animals. There's other questions you need to put radio collars out on. But for these big picture questions, we've developed a monitoring protocol that's all non-invasive, which I think is so exciting. And so we're just waiting for funding to implement that, because the big question is, you know, kind of, I mean, I think enough people still see lynx around the southwest part of the state. They actually just got the picture of the kitten and the mother at Molas Pass, so we did have reproduction again last year, which is exciting. But a big thing that's kind of, we want to know is what happened north of I-70. I mean, did they finally get into all those predicted habitat areas? You know, are they in the flat tops now? You know, do we have, and we know we've had cats go through there, but it's like, are there kittens up there now? Are they well-established populations? And we've got the methodology to do that and the ability to do that all non-invasively, which I think is exciting. And there's a whole laundry list of other things that we could look at. I mean, I could study lynx for a whole nother lifetime if I were given the opportunity. But there's lots of, it's still ongoing, but the reintroduction itself has been, we feel has been successful. And so again, this is just repetition, but for carnivore reintroductions, you have to make sure they're biologically supported, not only historically, but as climate is going to change, can you justify biologically putting it out there? You need to have sound organization for that reintroduction effort. You have to have political support. You need public support. You need to inform your publics about what's going on. Always be honest. You have to reintroduce enough animals to make it take. You know, that's one of the big reasons a lot of reintroductions fails. They don't put enough animals out there. And the problem, and the reason you have to do that is that you're going to get some mortality. You know, they aren't all going to be able to survive when you get them out there. So again, that you have to educate your publics and work to try to minimize that mortality, but you cannot ignore that it's going to happen, and you're going to have to bring in a lot more animals than you think you're going to need to. I would strongly urge anybody to monitor their animals once they've been released. We learned so much from that effort. And information not just for the lynx here in Colorado, but hopefully for other reintroduction efforts later on. And then the key thing is you have to do prey studies if you're going to study carnivores, and you should get started on them early and make them continuous so you can get that information. And lastly, I just want to remind everybody too is that this was a huge effort, and everybody worked so hard, and they kept that common objective and that common goal in mind, that this was about the animal. It was about establishing a viable population of lynx in Colorado, and it was about trying to maximize the survival rate for every individual animal that we could. And lots of people helped with that. And lastly, the pilots with the Colorado Division of Wildlife, absolutely phenomenal, incredible people. 10, 11 years of flying for these lynx over and over and over again. And the field crews were incredible. This is just a snapshot from one field season, but 10 years worth of incredible field techs that they were as dedicated as anybody else and as into the conservation of the species. And with that, this was one of our most interesting dens. We went out there, we knew a female, she had a den, and when we went out to find it, it was solid snow cover. We're like, where on earth does she have her kittens? And it was back in a dead, tipped over tree in there. But that was one of our favorite den sites because there was it was snow all around, and she found the one spot, one dry spot she could have those kittens out there. So, and with that, I can answer any questions you might have. Yes.
Are they here in our valley?
Okay, and I'm going to be repeating your question because I was asked to do that. And the question was whether or not we have lynx in the valley. And again, I can't tell you right now today, but definitely we used to come out here when we were actively snow tracking and track the cats up Lincoln Creek and things like that. And I know we snow tracked a cat around Marble area and everything like so. I would say you probably have lynx around here, and I think if you got out there, you could finally find some tracks.
No evidence that anyone has reproduced here in the valley. Any den?
Oh boy! Now see, you're getting my memory going about. Did we find a den over in this area? I can't quite remember. We definitely had dens up at the Independence Pass area, so it wouldn't surprise me. I can't right offhand remember a den on this side, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there. It means I'm over 25, and I can't remember that. So,
What was the age of the animals you were releasing?
The age of the animals that we were releasing, they varied, and that's a really great question because that's one of the things we looked at as far as the mortality we were seeing early on, and that is something that we learned, is that initially we brought down animals of all ages, even the young of the year, like so they would have come down here when they were about 7 months old. They would have been captured up there and brought down, all the way to we had animals that we estimated were probably 10, 11, 12 years old. And lynx typically might live in the wild till they're 15. And what we found is there was no difference in the age of the adults, but the kittens, that the young of the year that we brought down here had low survival rate. And that probably is because kittens typically spend the full first year of their life with their mother. And if they were captured up there when they were only 7 months old, they probably didn't have their full complement of hunting skills, perhaps. Again, this is just a hypothesis. But what we did after that, because we were looking at these release protocols constantly, and when we saw just a few of those young of the year dying, we changed our protocols and we wouldn't accept young of the year animals anymore from Canada. They had to be at least adults, at least 1 year old. The other thing that we learned in the early years is a few females were brought down that were pregnant, and they didn't seem to survive well either when we released them. And so what we did with that is we changed the time period when they were allowed to capture females that we would accept. And they had to be captured before breeding season started because we didn't want to, by accident, bring another pregnant female down. And so these are the kind of things that we learned in those early years. We had no way of knowing, because one of our early hypotheses was that maybe the young of the year would be the best because they'd be looking for a new territory. And it turned out, we think, again, our sample sizes were small, but that probably wasn't the best scenario. So then, of the adult ages, they ranged all over from a year to probably about 12 years old. Mm-hmm.
So is the reintroduction of lynx stopped for the time being?
So the question is whether the reintroduction of lynx has stopped here in Colorado, and it has. The last cats we brought in were in 2006, and because we've declared the reintroduction a success, and we wanted to move away from that heavy management, I doubt we ever bring more lynx down here. I don't think anyone has any plans for that. We really feel like, I mean, we have documented kittens born in Colorado giving birth, and those kittens giving birth. So we feel like, yeah, I mean, we have Colorado, cats down here now. So I don't think there's any plans to bring any more. We're hoping who's here, as long as we manage our habitat well enough, we're hoping that they'll stay here. Mm-hmm.
Are there any concerns about kind of the genetic, I don't know what the correct term is, like
bottleneck? The concern is about the genetic bottleneck, and there's a couple good things to bring up about that. Is early on I mentioned we compared the genetics of the of the lynx that used to be in Colorado. We only had found about 10 samples of that from museum specimens and everything. Compared that to the genetics of the lynx that were in Canada, and what we found is there was basically no difference. And because lynx are such strong dispersers, the genetics for lynx across almost all of Canada very similar. And so they already are a very mixed, have a lot of different alleles and things like that genetically. And so we brought cats down all the way across Canada, from British Columbia to Yukon to Manitoba to Quebec, all the way across. And the reason we did that is, again, over the years, because the hare cycle and the lynx cycle in Canada, when we started the project, the lynx were at their high in British Columbia, and we got most of our cats in the beginning from British Columbia and Alaska. And as the years went on, their lynx crashed, and those provinces, to their credit, said, we aren't going to give you cats this year because that will harm our population. And so we kept moving east, and we ended up at the end bringing all our cats in from Quebec. So the cats that were brought into Colorado were all genetically similar, but as broad of genetics as we possibly could get into Colorado, and we brought in 218 individuals, and not all of them bred. But we kind of did everything we possibly could to have that big genetic base. And then next, seeing the strong dispersal, if we have cats that are going to Montana, like I said, if we've got cats coming down, that's bringing in the genetics too and keeping that gene flow. And that's why it's going to be important to not isolate this population of lynx down here in Colorado, but try to keep those corridors open. Identify what a corridor is, try to protect it so we can keep the movements going back and forth. But it's a great question. It's a huge concern for all of our wildlife as our habitats become more and more fragmented.
And you talked about those corridors. Is there anyone in Iowa who's expecting to see lynx in their lifetime? And did you take the phone call?
Actually, the question was about the cat that went to Iowa, and actually I got some great phone calls over the 12 years. But what was interesting about the cat from Canada was it was a former colleague of mine that was studying bobcats in Iowa, and so he had a radio-collared population of bobcats he was studying up there. And people who saw the lynx just assumed it was one of the bobcats because it had a radio collar too, and they were used to seeing bobcats with radio collars. And so he called me and he goes, Tanya, he goes, that is not a bobcat. He goes, and of course we knew it was our lynx, you know, because we had the radio collars. And so we monitored that, and they weren't going to do anything about it until it got closer to breeding season. And then they didn't want that lynx there in breeding season, and we would have gone out and picked it up. And this is one of those things that, because it was a state effort in Colorado, we didn't think about contacting additional states right off the bat. And then we had all these cats going to all these states. We had to kind of do that really, really fast as to contact the states, and we had to respect each state's request whether we came and picked the animals up. Some of the states would call and say, we want you to come get this cat. You know, we didn't want these cats. And so that is something I would tell other people, and I forgot to mention that, I mentioned that in Carbondale, is that to prepare for these huge movements and what are you going to do, and to kind of be thinking ahead to your neighboring states and say, okay, so we're going to do this reintroduction, you might see some of these animals, and let's think ahead to how we're going to handle that. But for the most part it worked out well. But yeah.
Tanya, could you talk a little bit about kind of the broader reasons for reintroducing carnivores and their impact on the whole ecosystem? Why is there a focus on carnivores?
Yeah, the question was why the focus on carnivore reintroductions, and I think it's kind of one of the exciting things for me that, think about where we were 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, we were poisoning carnivores and shooting them and trying to get rid of them. And now there's a lot of effort and energy put into carnivore reintroduction. And I think it's because it's one of those things, the habitat and the prey base is still there, but we humans extirpated those carnivores. And I think there's some strong support, obviously not everybody, you know, to try to get those carnivores back in there. And you've shown, and it's been shown for some cases, I mean, the wolves back in Yellowstone is a classic example of the trickle-down effect of when you bring that top predator back in, how it trickles down all through the ecosystem, and you get a much more balanced, I should say, we don't call it balanced ecosystem, but you get a more representative ecosystem if you have all the parts back in there. And so I think people are seeing that. I mean, the more we try to put the pieces back, you know, the more things make sense out there. And I'm not saying that very well, but I think we just recognize what a huge impact carnivores have on an ecosystem. And if we're smart enough and we work with all the entities well enough, and we try to make concessions to the issues and the problems with carnivores, it becomes a little bit more acceptable. One thing I'm thinking about is how the defenders of wildlife are willing to pay for livestock damage from carnivores. I mean, that's enormous. I mean, that was an enormous great thing that we could that they contribute, that allow, and they helped with the lynx. I mean, the lynx took some sheep and they took chickens and a couple of peacocks and things like that, and defenders paid for all of that if people wanted that paid for. And that was good. And that's, again, involving all of our publics, even the people that aren't as conservation minded, but we have to recognize how we're impacting them and how we can modify that impact or do something about it. If that answers your question. I mean, I think we're just trying to put the pieces back in there.
Let's just do 3 more questions.
Mm-hmm.
Is this another animal in the foreground?
In the front, that's more kittens. Just on the back. Is that what you're seeing? This right here?
Yeah.
Balls of fur and kittens. I can't remember exactly. Usually the number of kittens at the den would range from 2 to 4. and 3 was the average. And we kept trying every year because, you know, during our reintroduction effort is when the lynx were recolonizing down in Maine a little bit, and they were getting reproduction. And in 2003, when we found our first kittens, we thought we were going to be the lynx reintroduction or reproduction news for the whole United States. And that year, they found all their dens had 5 kittens in them. And so I was like, they wouldn't even let us have that year. And he's a colleague of mine that was working on the Maine project. Says, why did you have to do that to us? But so you'd find from 2 to 4 kittens in our dens. We never had a 5-kitten den. But so those are just more kittens there. So it looks to me like there's 3, 2 in the forefront and then the one with the face there. That's what I guess. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned something briefly early on about there being discussion about introductions instead of reintroductions. I don't know if you were talking about Colorado or, you know, big time fauna, but can you elaborate on that?
Okay, the difference between the introductions and reintroductions, and I wasn't thinking Colorado specific because now I'm lucky. I went from a great job to another great job because now I got to think about all the national parks. But you know, the one thing people are talking about with introductions, it used to be you never wanted to do that, but with climate change, it is something that people are talking about more and more. They're calling it assisted migration. There's a whole bunch of different names for it. It's something that I think, you know, we have to be really cautionary. Every time we think we understand nature, we mess it up a lot of times. So an introduction is a really big thing to consider because you can really mess up an ecosystem too by putting something in there that doesn't belong. But people are trying to think, you always have to have people thinking outside the box. And as our climate changes and our landscapes change and what is protected changes, we may have to be thinking about some of these elaborate management schemes to keep some things, some of the species. The other way to approach it, though, that might be even safer is just these corridors and connecting the pieces we have left and letting the animals show us where they need to move to. Give them the ability to be able to move and find an area that's going to be more suitable to them. But I can't, you know, we can't eliminate that other possibility because it's certainly being considered. That people are trying to think ahead to where this species might occur. A classic one that I'm thinking of right now is as climate changes, they're thinking the jaguar habitat is going to move further north. And so may start calling it, you know, people are thinking way outside the box, are thinking, well, maybe we'll have jaguars, you know, in middle California or something like that, where we never had them before. So you have to have people thinking the whole spectrum, you know, from the really conservative to the people thinking way outside the box. And so that's just something to think about. Did you? Okay. Mm-hmm.
What was the approximate historical number of lynx throughout Colorado, and what's the percent that you're happy with?
The question was about the numbers of lynx that were historically in Colorado and what it is we're looking for. And that's such a great question because that was very controversial with the lynx reintroduction, is that some people felt there never was a viable population of lynx in Colorado. But the Colorado Division of Wildlife looked at all the evidence that we had. I mean, we had old trapping records and things like that, and the evidence was never, you know, 100% one way or the other, but in our opinion, it definitely weighed toward the side that we probably had a viable population of lynx at some time. Numbers impossible to get at. So when you're a biologist too, think about numbers. People always want to know, well, how many do you have? And it's like, okay, let's say we have 50. Is that enough? I mean, 50, I mean, the number of animals is an empty number. What you really want is their reproduction and their survival. And are you having enough reproduction to offset mortality? And then you have a viable population. And so most biologists, as opposed to getting how many do we have, we really want to get at what are our reproduction rates and what are our survival rates. And so that model I built, we got those estimates over the 13 years and built that in there and thought, we think we have a viable population. And then as a reintroduction, it's really interesting because we had not saturated, we didn't think, all the possible habitat lynx could have and, you know, be in the state. And so numbers are a funny thing. You know, you can, and even if you took that suitable habit or that predicted habitat map and you said, okay, well, the average home range size is about 75 square kilometers, which is what we found, and think, how many of those fit in there? But you can't even look at that because the home ranges, some of them were really tiny because it was great habitat, and some of them were really big because the cats were in marginal habitat. So, you know, you just have to look at the parameters that tell you a lot more about the population. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Tanya. What a wonderful presentation. I just want to give a special thanks to our lead sponsor tonight, which is Bristlecone Mountain Sports in Basal. Terrific outdoor store. Again, our terrific sponsors are what make these nights possible. And next week, we have climate change and water in the West with a national drought expert. So come on back. We'll see you next week. Thanks a lot.